Hey everyone, so here we are doing a tier list video on literally all 20 possible opening moves that we can play in chess. And so with all of these, we are not ranking them by what is objectively best, we are ranking them by objectively what I think, in my opinion, makes these the best opening moves for a surprise weapon. Okay, so the first one here, we have the pawn move to a3. And so this one, it doesn't do anything for opening principles, it's not really objectively good, but it does not harm our position too much. If we were to push one of our kingside pawns, then our king will be weaker when we castle kingside. And so a3 actually doesn't have too many drawbacks. And it might be a really good idea to try and surprise your opponent, but at the same time, we're not weakening our position too much. It's just more or less a not too useful pawn move. But perhaps later, transposition, we might even get a really decent opening. So I will say, actually, in a tier list, I think a3 is probably like level A. I think this is a pretty good opening to try if you want to really throw off your opponent. So next we have pawn to a4. And this one is very similar to the one we just looked at, but we're advancing a little bit further. The problem is, why are we advancing on the queenside flank? There's really no pawn storm there unless we really think they're going to castle queenside, and they're almost never castling that way here. And so a4 is not really too good of a move, but it doesn't hurt our position too terribly. From my experience, and again, I've played all 20 of these opening moves before, I think a4, you tend to get a little more vulnerable, and sometimes you even lose that pawn. Especially around move 10 to 20-ish. If you're not too careful, that pawn easily drops off. So not quite as good as a3. I'll put it maybe like a B ranking. Very next, we have pawn to b3, which is the Nimzo-Larsen attack, which is actually a really decent opening. And so that's actually pretty well known. It's played by Hikaru Nakamura very often. And so this could actually be a really decent opening with a lot of decent opening theory. Now, objectively, it's pretty good, but because there is some theory, I'm not going to list it as like an S tier because I think this is somewhat well known and almost more of a mainline opening. So with that being said, I think B3 probably more like A tier range, and so I'll put it up to there. Okay, yeah, so that sounds about right. And so now let's go to pawn to B4. And so B4 is known as the Polish opening, or sometimes known as the orangutan opening. This B4 move does have a lot of tricks to it, and so it is a really solid opening, but it's also got a lot of tactical things that if you study, even if it's only like 10-15 minutes, you can learn a lot that can really throw off your opponent if they're really unprepared. And so a lot of really cool traps with it. It's also pretty solid. I'm actually saying pawn B4 I think is S tier. If you want to throw your opponent off, this is a really good option I think that you could start looking into. Even Bobby Fischer has used this opening before. And so if it's good enough for him to surprise an opponent, it's probably good enough for you as well. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So the next one is pawn to c3, which is Saragossa opening. I've actually had a lot of fun with this one. And if you want, you could even transpose by playing d4 and e3 and end up with some kind of Kale system, which is actually a pretty normal opening. You could also use this to transpose into a London if that's what you play as white. But you're probably not playing a London system if you're wanting to throw off your opponent. So I actually like c3, sometimes queen to a4 along with it. Perhaps in some lines you might also go queen c2. And so really there's a lot of possibilities that if you study and your opponent doesn't, even if it's just a few minutes, you can get some creative ideas that might throw them off. So c3 is a move I really like. But at the same time, c3 is not so great objectively long term. And so I'm thinking probably more maybe around B tier. Very next we have pawn to c4, known as the English opening. And this one is a really solid, respectable mainline opening. And so I would say probably objectively, the 4 best opening moves that you can choose are either e4, d4, c4, or knight f3. And those 4 are pretty well common. Some of them transpose into each other. And so for here, I don't really like this as a surprise opening. But of the main 4 openings I just mentioned, I think it's the better of the 4 because it's solid but also fairly less common and can also be its own thing. Knight f3, from my experience, tends to transpose to d4 openings, whereas c4, it doesn't have to go that way. It can stay its own thing. And so c4 I kind of like as a really solid opening, but as a surprise weapon, not too much, because a lot of people might know the theory. Plus, there's a lot of positional concepts that this opening can get involved with. And so some of those nuances are really something that needs to be studied and not to be used as a surprise weapon. The English opening, I think, is actually C tier when it comes for opening moves and having that surprise value. So next we have pawn to d3, and there are some openings that you can transpose with this, and some of them are sort of tricky-ish, But overall, I just really don't like this move. It's passive, and it doesn't really do much to control the center. It blocks our king's bishop from developing out of f1. So this move I really don't like too much. I'm actually going to give this a D ranking here. I don't really like this move. I don't think it does a ton, and I don't think it's really going to shock your opponent. You might just get a passive position, but not really the tactical play we're looking for when we're trying to surprise them. So next we have pawn to d4, which is a very solid move, but unfortunately for surprise value, playing something positional like a queen's gambit is not going to throw off too many people unless you're an e4 player and then you randomly switch to d4. But even in that case, most people have a lot of theory known for both e4 and d4 because they're such popular openings. So really, you might think you're throwing them off, but you're probably walking into a position that you're just less familiar with, and they probably know better than you. So d4 is definitely a D ranking, and very similarly, we'll probably say the same for e4 when it comes up. But okay, going in order, we have next pawn e3. And e3 I actually like a decent amount. Garry Kasparov has used this against Deep Blue, a famous way to try and throw it off, thinking that the computer wouldn't be able to, have that line as well studied as the main lines. Now, e3, again, very similar to c3, could also transpose into some kind of Kali system if we so chose. So it's a really decent opening move to start with. If you want to throw off your opponent with something kind of tricky, but maybe transpose into something decently solid later on, this move has a lot of transpositional power, and it can really become a lot of different solid openings. So with that being said, e3 is actually kind of decent. I'd say maybe about like B tier, I think, is probably about accurate for this. And now we come to the e4 move that we've recently mentioned, in line with what I was saying before. I would just put it here as a D tier ranking. Not too good for surprising people. If you're a positional player, you play d4 a lot, and you really want to switch to e4, it's decent-ish in the fact you're confusing them, but again, they have so much theory they know, they probably just know more than you. Not really too helpful. I say it's just a D ranking. And now pawn to f3. So f3 I don't really like too much either. It just weakens your king right on move 1. Already you're weak on that diagonal all the way to the h4 square. And so from that, you're just weakening your king right on move 1. Not really too good. I'll say maybe like a C tier ranking. It's maybe like C, maybe close to B if you really intend king to f2 and then play that silly joke opening. Some call that Bobby Fischer's joke opening. Some call it the Hammerschlag opening. Either way, maybe that's the only viable thing you can do with f3. If you want to play something more solid, but also tricky, such as the Boer attack and the Sov defense, then you'll play f3 there, but that'll come much later than move 1. So playing f3 this early, I really don't like it, even if we're intending to play something like in supporting pawn to e4. So next we have pawn to f4, which is known as the bird's opening. And this one I think is a little better than f3 actually, because yes, we are weakening the king somewhat, just like with the f3 move, but at least we're fighting for the center a little bit more. I think f4 is a little more solid, helps control some of the center, and although you do weaken your king, maybe you can play it kind of like your Dutch defense with colors reversed, and you get an extra tempo. So, maybe it could be something worth experimenting with. So next we have pawn to g3, and the problem with this move is it's very clear what we are intending. We are just going to fianchetto our bishop in pretty much every single line, and if we're going to play g3 and bishop g2, the problem is that's such a well-known common setup and fairly solid. It could be some kind of King's Indian attack. It could be some kind of Catalan. It could be just a g3 thing on its own, and then we fianchetto. But in almost all cases, it's just very well-known opening theory, and probably something that we do not want to be surprising our opponent with if we have almost no study, and we just want to come up with something cool to kind of throw our opponent off. So g3, not really loving too much. And I think actually g3, as solid as it is, I will say it's probably D tier. So next we have pawn to g4, which is the famous Grob opening, where we are just going to gambit a pawn very early with that c8 bishop possibly taking it. This opening I actually really like for surprise value. Now, objectively, I really don't like this opening, and it's really bad. If you were to look at the openings, it's one of the worst that you could possibly start with. But for surprise value, this does have some merit, because there are a lot of tricks to it. You're basically playing for a lot of tactical tricks and hoping that your opponent is unprepared and hasn't done their homework on how to face this opening. This is exactly what we want when we're trying to surprise an opponent. So I would almost want to give this an S tier just because of that, but I'm going to say A tier only because it's refuted in a few different ways, and Sure, you'll have to study 10, 20 moves of theory, but even if they don't do that and they just want to play solid and they avoid some of the main traps, they'll get a pretty good position against you. And so that's why I put it as A and not S. But really, when it comes to opening surprise and that shock value, the Grob opening is a classic to try. If you haven't tried it, it takes just a few minutes to really learn those tactical ideas, maybe 10, 15 minutes again, sit down, or even longer, and then you just, start learning some of the ideas. But next we come to pawn to h3, which I think is Clement's opening, I believe, if I recall correctly. Not too common at all, which does make it kind of good for surprise value. But unfortunately, it does weaken our king a little bit on move 1, and doesn't really accomplish too much. It doesn't really help us with the center, it doesn't really have too many tricks to it, and doesn't really do much. Like, they can more or less ignore it. And so I'll say maybe like a B ranking, I think, with this one. If this move were to do a little bit more, then maybe I would give it a higher value. But as is, I think just moving your H-pawn a little bit, it weakens your king slightly, but not much else. And, they'll probably just play regular opening principles, contest the center, most likely D5 or E5, and then you get a regular game, but there isn't really too much that I see with this move. But now that brings me to pawn H4, which actually is probably one of my favorites if we're going to try for surprise value. And maybe I'm a little sentimental with this move because I've actually beaten some very strong chess players with it, including some 2000 rated players over the board by throwing them off with H4. It's a really fun opening, and there are some positional factors as well as attacking, but in a lot of lines, we're just going to start advancing this pawn, H4, H5, and almost playing like this kind of kingside pawn storm. This is especially useful if they like a King's Indian defense, or they like some kind of fianchetto idea where their G7 pawn ends up on G6. You're already going after that pawn lever immediately. So H4, I actually like a ton. I'm definitely giving that an S tier here. And for the people who are a little more positional, if you play H4 and then choose not to play anything to do with it, you just start developing normally, you get a decent position. And so if you want to play a positional game where maybe that pawn is a little vulnerable, but it's not the end of the world, H4 and then not advancing at all could also be kind of useful. So S tier for Harry the H-pawn, and we'll continue with the tier list. So next we have the knight moves. So we'll start with knight to A3, and this one is known as the sodium attack, because Na3, sodium, periodic table of elements. But of course, that's not for every language. Magnus Carlsen famously was confused by this because it is different in Norwegian as well as other languages. But objectively, with the memes aside and jokes and silliness, I'd say it's like a C tier. Not really too great. I know a lot of these surprise openings are not really going for objectively best anyway. Maybe that knight could relocate itself to something like C2 after you push your C pawn to C3. But overall, it's not really doing a ton. It's somewhat fun if you look at some of the main lines, but for surprise value, I'd still say more like C tier. Not really too much. So next we have knight to C3, which is actually a really solid opening that is not super popular. And so if you're willing to study a little bit, a little more than some of these other openings, maybe even if you just have half an hour, and you just want to learn some of the main lines of this opening, that's probably half an hour or an hour longer than some of your opponents have. Because knight to C3 is not too popular at all, but it's decent. And positionally, what ends up happening is this knight usually goes on a little bit of a tour, and it kind of starts relocating itself, oftentimes to the king side, sometimes usually like back to E2 or something. But even if it just sits there on C3 and it's controlling a lot of the opening, you're developing a piece, controlling the center, it's really good for opening principles. And so for that, I actually think it's probably like a B tier or so. I think it's actually a pretty decent opening. And if you wanted to play this as kind of your main repertoire, might even bump it up to like A. But just as a surprise, I'd say B tier is probably pretty accurate. So yeah, I'd say that's a pretty good opening try. So next we have knight to F3, which is a super solid opening. It's one of the main four that I mentioned earlier, but unfortunately for surprise value, we're just going to put it in D tier because it's really not that great for that shock value. People probably have some kind of theory that they know with it, and even if they don't, it'll probably transpose to one of the other openings, probably King's Indian attack, something along those lines, or it might just stay its own Ret T system type thing. But either way, knight F3, very popular, objectively good, not too good for surprise value. And now knight H3, which is just really comical. It's like one of the stereotype bad moves. Like if you were just playing opening move, what's the worst one you could play? I don't know if this is the worst, but it's up there, right? We are developing a piece, which is good, but what are we doing on h3? Nothing on the edge of the board. Maybe very similar to what I mentioned with knight to a3. This knight might relocate itself. Maybe the h3 knight might come back to f2 at some point. There might be some silly maneuvering there, but overall it's a waste of time. And even if you let your opponent get the center, it's more of a statement thing that you're just playing some silly moves than is really surprise value or anything to trick them. I'd say this is more like a C tier opening. I don't think it's really that great, but if you want to look into it, you know, any of these could be worth experimenting with. So this is my tier list here. I think it actually looks pretty good. I think we've done a fairly good job with this here. And I guess the main takeaways are if you want to play an S tier opening, I really like B4 or H4. And if you want to see me do a video on either of these, or also on the Grob, the tier just below it, or even A3 or any of these other opening moves, well, let me know in the YouTube comments because these are some good openings. For example, A3 it became really famous when Anderson used it in a very famous game to beat a really strong player. And a lot of these openings, they have a little story behind them. You know, B4 is very common. Where's B4 here? Oh, yeah, that's right, S tier. Yeah, you know, orangutan, very funny story with that. And so there's a lot of really cool things that you can try with some of these openings. Just takes a little experimenting, a little fun. You know, you could try being really solid and doing one opening, but after a while, you just want to mix things up, throw your opponents off, especially if you play at a regular chess club or somewhere where you're playing the same people constantly. Every now and then throwing them a little curveball, even if you lose, it's just really good for entertainment value. And especially if you win, then you have like those like extra brownie points for being able to throw them off and win with the silly opening, you know, so you can't really lose when you're doing that. So if you had fun, you won. Thanks for stopping by, everyone. Hope you liked this tier list. I'll see you in the next chess video.